The easiest people to underestimate are often the ones with the strongest roots. That was the lesson Titan Ridge Development would learn too late when they decided that a 74-year-old widow standing alone on a quiet Iowa farm was nothing more than the final obstacle between them and a billion-dollar construction project. For nearly 5 decades, Eleanor Brooks had greeted every sunrise the same way, stepping onto her weathered front porch with a steaming mug of black coffee while the first light rolled across 120 acres of fertile farmland. Every fence post, every maple tree lining the gravel driveway, every weathered red barn carried memories of her late husband, Samuel, who had spent his entire life turning ordinary soil into one of the most respected family farms in the county. After Samuel passed away 8 years earlier, neighbors quietly wondered how long Eleanor could hold on by herself. Developers wondered something different. They wondered how cheaply they could convince her to leave. Across the county, farmland had been disappearing one parcel at a time, replaced by warehouses, luxury homes, and sprawling commercial developments. Titan Ridge Development had already purchased thousands of surrounding acres, and their ambitious master plan promised jobs, shopping centers, hotels, and millions in tax revenue. There was only one problem. Eleanor's farm sat directly in the center of the final construction phase. Without her land, the entire project would remain incomplete. At first, the company approached politely. Representatives mailed glossy brochures filled with beautiful architectural renderings and generous offers that most families would have accepted without hesitation. $8 million became 10. 10 became 12. Friends urged Eleanor to retire somewhere warmer. Even county officials quietly suggested that progress was inevitable. Eleanor simply smiled, thanked everyone for their concern, and continued repairing fences, tending fields, and maintaining the farmhouse exactly as she always had. Her answer never changed. This farm wasn't an investment. It wasn't real estate. It was home. Weeks later, the company's chief executive, Richard Caldwell, decided to visit personally. His black SUV rolled slowly down the gravel drive, stopping beside the old farmhouse where Eleanor was stacking firewood for the coming winter. Dressed in an expensive tailored suit that looked strangely out of place beside muddy boots and weathered tractors, Richard greeted her with practiced confidence. He explained that Titan Ridge wasn't merely buying land. They were creating the future. He spoke of economic growth, opportunity, and prosperity before sliding a neatly prepared folder across the porch railing. Inside was an offer worth $12 million. Richard smiled as though the conversation had already ended. Eleanor glanced at the paperwork for only a moment before carefully closing the folder and handing it back. She looked toward the distant fields where generations of her family had planted, harvested, celebrated, and mourned together. Then she calmly said, "My husband didn't spend his life protecting this place, so someone else could erase it." Richard's smile faded just enough to reveal the impatience beneath his polished manners. He reminded her that everyone eventually sold. Eleanor simply shook her head. As Richard climbed back into his SUV, he looked across the property one last time before quietly saying something that sounded less like a prediction and more like a promise. "Every project has a deadline, Mrs. Brooks." Eleanor watched the vehicle disappear beyond the trees without responding. She had no idea that the deadline Richard mentioned had already begun counting down, or that within a matter of days, decisions made inside corporate boardrooms would set in motion events that neither of them could ever undo. The next morning, life on the Brooks farm unfolded with the same quiet rhythm that had guided Eleanor for decades, but beyond the familiar sounds of birds, tractors, and distant whine through the trees, forces she could neither see nor hear were already moving against her. Less than 20 miles away, the executive boardroom at Titan Ridge Development overlooked a skyline filled with cranes and glass towers. Richard Caldwell stood before a wall-sized project map, his expression calm but increasingly impatient as engineers, attorneys, and investors gathered around the polished conference table. One section of the map remained highlighted in bright red, interrupting every roadway, utility line, and commercial district they had planned for years. The label read simply, Brooks Farm. One investor leaned forward and broke the silence. "How much longer are we waiting?" Another executive answered before Richard could speak. Construction delays are already costing us nearly $400,000 every day. Richard folded his arms and stared at the map. She will sell, he replied confidently. Everyone eventually does. Yet confidence alone did not satisfy anxious investors. Their financing agreements required strict construction milestones, and every missed deadline placed millions of dollars at risk. The board demanded solutions instead of optimism. By the end of the meeting, Richard received an unmistakable message. Complete Phase 3 immediately, or explain to shareholders why the largest development in company history was falling behind schedule because of one elderly widow. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of the conversations unfolding inside expensive offices. She spent the afternoon repairing a section of split fence near the western pasture before driving her aging pickup truck into the nearby town to purchase feed and hardware supplies. Nearly everyone she met offered advice. Some encouraged her to accept the generous offer before circumstances changed. Others quietly admired her determination but admitted they doubted she could resist forever. Eleanor thanked each person with the same gentle smile. She understood why they believed money could solve everything. What they could not understand was that every acre carried memories impossible to measure in dollars. Late that evening, as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, headlights slowly approached the farmhouse once again. This time they belonged not to Richard Caldwell but to Thomas Reed, Titan Ridge's chief legal advisor. Unlike Richard, Thomas spoke softly and carried no visible arrogance. He respectfully introduced himself before asking whether they might talk for a few minutes. Eleanor invited him onto the porch. Thomas explained that he had reviewed the company's previous offers and believed there was still room for compromise. He promised lifetime financial security, comprehensive medical coverage, and even a charitable foundation bearing Samuel Brooks's name if she agreed to sell voluntarily. Eleanor listened patiently until he finished. Then she looked toward the old oak tree standing beside the barn where Samuel had once hung a wooden swing for their grandchildren. Some things, she said quietly, are worth protecting even when nobody else understands why. Thomas lowered his eyes, realizing persuasion had failed once again. Before leaving, however, he hesitated for just a moment. Mrs. Brooks, he said carefully, there are people inside this company who no longer believe waiting is the best option. Eleanor thanked him for his honesty, but his words lingered in the cool evening air long after his car disappeared down the gravel road. Several miles away, Richard Caldwell received a brief phone call confirming that negotiations had reached another dead end. He remained silent for several seconds before opening a locked drawer inside his office and removing a folder marked Phase 3 Contingency. As he slowly placed it on his desk, he whispered to himself, if she refuses to move, then the schedule will. Outside his office window, rain clouds quietly gathered over the horizon, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, the future of the Brooks family farm no longer rested in Eleanor's hands alone. 3 days passed without another visit from Titan Ridge, and Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps reason had finally prevailed. The fields were ready for the next planting season, the machinery had been serviced, and the old farmhouse settled into its familiar rhythm once again. Before sunrise on Thursday morning, she left for Cedar Falls to attend a routine medical appointment that had been scheduled months earlier. It was a trip she could not postpone, and she expected to return before dinner. As her pickup truck disappeared onto the county highway, another convoy began, moving in the opposite direction. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, 3 bulldozers, several excavators, and a fleet of construction trucks rolled through the entrance of Titan Ridge's active construction site. The operators had received revised maps only an hour earlier. Their supervisor, Mark Ellison, studied the documents one final time before speaking over the radio. According to the paperwork, the western section of Brooks Farm had already been cleared for site preparation. Mark frowned for a moment. Something about the property lines did not seem right. He had worked construction for more than 20 years, and experienced operators learned to trust their instincts. He called the project office seeking confirmation. A short reply came back almost immediately. Proceed according to the updated survey. All approvals are complete. Satisfied that responsibility rested somewhere above his position, Mark gave the signal to continue. Heavy equipment slowly crossed the gravel boundary road and entered the western edge of Eleanor's property. Fence posts were carefully removed, old irrigation pipes were lifted from the ground, and rows of mature maple trees that had shaded the pasture for generations disappeared one after another beneath the steady work of powerful machines. Dust drifted across the open fields while neighboring farmers watched from a distance in stunned silence. Several attempted to contact Eleanor, but her cellular phone remained switched off inside the medical clinic where reception was unreliable. Around noon, Margaret Dawson, whose family had lived beside the Brooks farm for nearly 30 years, finally reached the county planning office. She asked whether Eleanor had secretly sold her land without telling anyone. The employees searched official records before answering with obvious confusion. No ownership transfer has been recorded. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. If no sale had taken place, then why was heavy construction already underway? She immediately drove toward the property, arriving just as another section of fencing disappeared. She demanded that the site supervisor stop the work until Eleanor returned. Mark politely explained that he possessed signed authorization and approved survey documents issued through Titan Ridge. Although Margaret insisted there had to be some mistake, the machinery continued operating because every document appeared legitimate. Nearly 5 hours after leaving home, Eleanor turned onto the familiar county road expecting another peaceful evening. Instead, she noticed an unusual cloud of dust hanging over the horizon long before she reached her driveway. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. As she rounded the final curve, the sight before her left her speechless. The western pasture where Samuel had once taught their grandchildren to ride horses no longer existed as she remembered it. Long stretches of fencing were gone. Fresh earth stretched across acres that had remained untouched for decades. Workers were loading equipment onto trailers as though the day's assignment had already been completed. Eleanor slowly stepped from her truck, without saying a word. Several neighbors hurried toward her, their faces filled with concern. Before anyone could explain what had happened, a black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled quietly onto the property. Richard Caldwell stepped out carrying a neatly prepared envelope and a calm expression that suggested he believed everything was already under control. He walked toward Eleanor, extended the envelope, and said with measured confidence, "Mrs. Brooks, there has been an unfortunate misunderstanding, but I believe this will compensate you fairly." Eleanor accepted the envelope without opening it. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on the changed landscape stretching beyond Richard's shoulder. Then, in a voice so calm that it unsettled everyone standing nearby, she asked a single question that Richard was completely unprepared to answer. "Before I read this, Mr. Caldwell, are you absolutely certain your company knows what was buried beneath that field?" Richard Caldwell glanced across the freshly disturbed field before looking back at Eleanor with a faint smile that barely concealed his confidence. "Mrs. Brooks," he replied, "our surveyors have completed every required review. If there was an error, we are fully prepared to compensate you." Eleanor slowly lowered the envelope without opening it. "Compensation only works when you understand what was lost," she answered quietly. "You seem very certain that you do." Richard assumed she was speaking from grief rather than fact. He explained that the company had already calculated the value of the damaged fencing, irrigation equipment, and crops. A generous settlement would be delivered immediately, and additional payments could follow if necessary. Around them, neighbors watched in complete silence, expecting Eleanor to argue or demand answers. Instead, she simply nodded once, turned toward the farmhouse, and walked away without another word. Richard stood motionless for several seconds before handing instructions to his legal team. "She will call a lawyer tomorrow," he said calmly. "Offer a little more money if necessary. We will close this before it becomes a headline." He climbed into his vehicle, convinced the situation was already under control. Eleanor entered the old farmhouse, closed the front door behind her, and stood quietly inside the dim hallway. Every photograph on the wall reminded her of Samuel, of harvest festivals, family reunions, and countless ordinary moments that had become priceless with time. Yet she did not stop to look at them. Instead, she walked directly into Samuel's study, a room that had remained almost untouched since the day he passed away. Dust floated through the fading afternoon light as she knelt beside an old oak desk. Hidden beneath a woven rug was a small iron floor safe that very few people even knew existed. Eleanor entered the combination without hesitation. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, a collection of faded photographs, handwritten journals, and one large cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax that had cracked with age. Across the front, in Samuel's careful handwriting, were 6 simple words. Open only if they ever come. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment before carefully breaking the brittle seal. Inside lay several official documents bearing federal letterheads, detailed survey maps, signed agreements, and a letter dated more than 50 years earlier. She quietly gathered everything into a leather portfolio before making a single telephone call. On the other end answered Daniel Harper, an attorney whose family had represented farmers across Iowa for 3 generations. Eleanor rarely asked anyone for help, but this time her voice carried unusual urgency. "Daniel," she said softly, "I think it is finally time." Early the following morning, Daniel welcomed Eleanor into his modest office overlooking the county courthouse. He expected to review a routine property dispute involving damaged farmland and compensation negotiations. Eleanor placed the weathered portfolio on his desk without saying a word. Daniel opened the first document casually. Within seconds, his expression changed. He adjusted his glasses, leaned closer, and continued reading in complete silence. Minutes passed before he reached the final page. Then he slowly looked up at Eleanor, disbelief written across his face. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "Since Samuel gave them to me before he passed away," Eleanor answered. Daniel carefully spread the documents across his desk, comparing signatures, federal seals, survey coordinates, and archived registration numbers. He reached for his telephone, stopped halfway, and lowered his hand again, as though reconsidering his next move. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and spoke the one sentence Eleanor had quietly expected for years. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "if these documents are authentic, Titan Ridge has made a mistake so extraordinary that they still do not realize what they have actually destroyed." Daniel Harper spent the rest of the morning verifying every page inside the portfolio. He contacted county archives, compared survey coordinates, and requested copies of historical federal records that had long since been moved into digital storage. One confirmation followed another. Every signature matched. Every registration number remained active. By noon, the uncertainty had disappeared entirely. Daniel closed the final file and looked directly at Eleanor. "Samuel knew this day might come," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "He always believed that someday someone would see this land as nothing more than another construction site." Daniel carefully organized the documents into separate folders. "They think this is an ordinary property dispute," he continued. "It is nothing of the sort." More than 50 years earlier, Samuel Brooks had participated in a cooperative agricultural preservation program sponsored by the United States Department of Agriculture and several Midwestern universities. Working alongside plant scientists, he had helped cultivate and protect an exceptionally rare collection of heritage seed varieties capable of surviving severe droughts and unpredictable weather. The western fields had never simply produced corn and soybeans. Beneath carefully maintained layers of soil rested one of the country's oldest continuously preserved agricultural research sites, protected under multiple agreements that remained legally enforceable decades later. Every planting season, small seed samples had been cataloged, documented, and quietly shared with research institutions across the nation. The exact location had intentionally remained confidential to prevent commercial exploitation. Even many county officials had no idea the preservation area still existed. Daniel opened another document containing detailed aerial maps and carefully traced the highlighted boundary with his finger. His expression grew even more serious. "Richard Caldwell did not simply authorize construction on private farmland," he said. "His company entered federally protected research property without understanding what it represented." Eleanor remained calm, although the weight of Samuel's foresight settled heavily upon her. She remembered countless evenings when he insisted on documenting every planting record, every soil analysis, every agreement, and every inspection report. At the time, She believed he was simply being meticulous. Now she understood that he had been building a legal shield strong enough to outlive both of them. Later that afternoon, Daniel assembled a team that included an agricultural law specialist, a historical land survey expert, and Dr. Rebecca Collins, a nationally respected botanist from Iowa State University. They visited the Brooks farm together, carefully walking across the disturbed western field. Dr. Collins stopped repeatedly to examine exposed soil, remaining unusually quiet throughout the inspection. Finally, she stood and removed her gloves. The preservation markers were exactly where the federal maps indicated they would be, she said. The construction equipment passed directly through the protected research zone. Daniel asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Can the damage simply be restored? Dr. Collins slowly shook her head. The land itself can recover over time, but what existed here represented decades of uninterrupted environmental data. Some of that information cannot simply be recreated. At Titan Ridge headquarters, Richard Caldwell remained completely unaware of the investigation unfolding only a few miles away. His attention focused instead on reassuring investors that construction would soon return to schedule. During an executive meeting, he confidently announced that the disagreement with Eleanor Brooks would likely end with a routine financial settlement. Several board members appeared relieved, believing the risk had already passed. As the meeting concluded, Richard's assistant entered carrying a certified overnight delivery envelope addressed personally to the chief executive officer. Assuming it contained another negotiation request, Richard casually opened it in front of the board. Instead of a settlement proposal, he found a formal legal notice informing Titan Ridge that all further activity affecting the Brooks property must cease immediately pending multiple claims involving federal agricultural protections and historical preservation agreements. Richard read the first page twice before his confident smile quietly disappeared. Within 24 hours, the dispute that Richard Caldwell believed would disappear with a settlement check had become something far more dangerous. Federal officials contacted the county planning office requesting copies of every permit connected to Phase 3 of the Titan Ridge development. Survey records, environmental assessments, and construction approvals were suddenly placed under review. No one inside the company had expected agencies outside the state to become involved, and uncertainty quickly spread through the executive offices. Richard immediately called an emergency meeting with his attorneys. Thick binders covered the conference table as legal advisors reviewed the notice delivered by Daniel Harper. The room remained unusually quiet until one attorney finally broke the silence. If these preservation agreements are valid, we are no longer discussing ordinary property damage. Richard leaned forward. Then what are we discussing? The attorney hesitated before answering. Potential violations involving federally protected agricultural research assets, environmental preservation agreements, and unauthorized disturbance of registered conservation property. Richard dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. We relied on updated survey maps. Mistakes happen. We will negotiate. Another attorney looked far less confident. That defense only works if the protected area was properly identified in the public records. If these agreements remained active and discoverable during due diligence, opposing counsel will argue that Titan Ridge had a responsibility to find them before construction began. At nearly the same moment, Daniel Harper and his team continued gathering evidence with remarkable precision. Dr. Rebecca Collins coordinated specialists from Iowa State University to document every section of the disturbed field. Soil samples were collected, historical planting records were matched with archived federal reports, and decades of research data were carefully reconstructed from Samuel Brooks's meticulous journals. Every new document strengthened the same conclusion. Samuel had not merely preserved farmland. He had quietly protected one of the longest continuous agricultural resilience studies in the region, contributing valuable genetic research that scientists still referenced during modern climate adaptation projects. Eleanor listened as Dr. Collins explained the significance of Samuel's work. Most people believe valuable research happens only inside laboratories, she said. Sometimes the most important laboratory is a family farm that has remained untouched for generations. Eleanor smiled gently. Samuel always believed that good soil remembers everything. Daniel nodded. Fortunately for us, So do written records. During the following week, independent investigators interviewed former university researchers who had worked with Samuel decades earlier. Several retired scientists willingly provided sworn statements confirming that the Brooks property had remained part of an ongoing preservation network even after public funding changed over the years. One elderly professor produced photographs showing federal inspection teams visiting the farm nearly 40 years earlier. Another located correspondence describing the Western Field as an irreplaceable environmental reference site whose uninterrupted condition was considered essential for future research. Every discovery made the legal position against Titan Ridge substantially stronger. Richard attempted to calm increasingly nervous investors by insisting the disagreement remained manageable, but confidence began fading when financial institutions requested additional information regarding the potential liability. Insurance representatives also informed the company that certain claims involving protected federal resources might not fall under ordinary construction coverage. For the first time since launching the project, board members openly questioned whether the company had underestimated the risks. Late one afternoon, Richard received another certified package from Daniel Harper's office. This time it contained far more than legal arguments. Attached were authenticated federal agreements, expert reports, sworn scientific statements, historical aerial photographs, and a preliminary assessment indicating that the true value of the damaged preservation site extended far beyond ordinary market prices. Richard slowly turned the final page before lowering the document onto his desk. Beneath the closing paragraph appeared one sentence that immediately silenced the room around him. This filing represents only the initial estimate of damages, and additional claims remain under active review. The courthouse was already crowded. Long before the hearing began, local farmers filled nearly every public seat, joined by university researchers, reporters, environmental advocates, and representatives from agricultural organizations across the Midwest. What had begun as a disagreement over one family's land had quietly grown into a case that many believed could influence how federally protected agricultural sites would be treated for years to come. Eleanor Brooks arrived carrying nothing more than a small leather portfolio and the same calm expression she had worn throughout the ordeal. Daniel Harper organized several binders on the plaintiff's table while Dr. Rebecca Collins reviewed the scientific exhibits, one final time. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell entered surrounded by corporate attorneys, financial consultants, and public relations advisors. His confident walk had disappeared. Every conversation inside his legal team seemed shorter and more urgent than the last. As proceedings began, Titan Ridge argued that the construction work resulted from an unfortunate surveying mistake made in good faith. Their attorneys emphasized that the company had relied upon professional consultants and had immediately offered financial compensation after discovering the disputed work area. They insisted there had been no intention to damage protected property because the company had never known such protections existed. Daniel stood and calmly approached the bench. Rather than challenge the statement directly, he requested permission to introduce a series of internal corporate communications obtained during discovery. The judge granted the request. One by one, enlarged electronic displays appeared inside the courtroom. The first showed project schedules discussing the financial consequences of every delayed construction day. Another revealed executive memoranda describing Brooks Farm as the only remaining obstacle preventing completion of Phase 3. Then came electronic messages exchanged between senior executives only days before the construction began. In one message, an executive warned that additional historical verification should be completed before any work continued near the Brooks property. The recommendation received only a brief response from Richard Caldwell. "We cannot afford another delay. Proceed according to the revised schedule." The courtroom remained completely silent. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply displayed another document. This time it was a due diligence checklist prepared months before construction started. Several required historical preservation reviews remained incomplete. A final notation beside one unchecked item read, "Further archival research recommended." The recommendation had never been followed. Titan Ridge's lead attorney attempted to object, arguing that incomplete paperwork did not prove deliberate misconduct. Daniel nodded respectfully before introducing the next witness. Thomas Reed, the company's former chief legal advisor, walked slowly to the witness stand. The courtroom recognized him immediately. Months earlier, he had personally visited Eleanor in one final attempt to negotiate a peaceful agreement. Under oath, Thomas explained that he had repeatedly advised Titan Ridge to postpone construction until every historical record had been fully verified. He testified that uncertainty surrounding the Brooks property had concerned him enough to recommend additional legal review before any heavy equipment entered the area. When asked why his recommendation had not been followed, Thomas paused for several seconds before answering quietly. Because management believed the financial cost of waiting exceeded the legal risk. A murmur spread throughout the gallery before the judge restored order. Richard lowered his eyes toward the defense table without speaking. Daniel then called Dr. Rebecca Collins, who carefully explained decades of uninterrupted agricultural research supported by federal agreements, scientific publications, archived inspection reports, and historical field data. Using maps, photographs, and preservation records, she demonstrated that the disturbed section represented far more than ordinary farmland. It had served as a unique living research site whose continuous environmental history could never be fully recreated. As her testimony concluded, Daniel returned to the plaintiff's table and quietly organized his papers. He had not yet discussed financial damages. He had not yet presented the expert valuation. And everyone inside the courtroom suddenly realized that the most difficult part of Titan Ridge's defense was still waiting to begin. After 8 days of testimony, expert reports, and documentary evidence, the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Daniel Harper rose for his final presentation. Instead of speaking immediately, he placed a single photograph on the evidence screen. It showed Samuel Brooks standing beside Eleanor nearly 40 years earlier, both smiling in the middle of the same western field that now lay scarred by construction equipment. This case, Daniel began calmly, has never been about refusing progress. It has never been about stopping development. It is about the responsibility that comes with power. When a corporation has the resources to reshape entire communities, it also carries the obligation to know exactly what stands in its path before it moves forward. He then introduced the final witness, Dr. Michael Reynolds, one of the nation's leading agricultural economists. Using decades of production records, scientific archives, federal preservation agreements, and independent environmental studies, Dr. Reynolds explained that the true value of the damaged site could not be measured by acreage alone. The uninterrupted research data, preserved genetic diversity, educational partnerships, and future agricultural applications represented an irreplaceable national resource. After several hours of testimony, he presented his final assessment. The total economic impact, including restoration costs, research losses, contractual obligations, environmental recovery, and statutory damages, exceeded $750 million. Audible whispers spread across the courtroom. Several Titan Ridge executives exchanged stunned looks, while investors sitting in the gallery quietly lowered their heads. Richard Caldwell remained motionless, staring toward the witness stand as though he had misunderstood the number. His attorneys immediately challenged the valuation, arguing that no single farm could reasonably justify such extraordinary damages. Dr. Reynolds responded with remarkable composure. If this had been an ordinary farm, I would agree. It was not. He carefully explained that the valuation reflected decades of federally recognized preservation work supported by extensive documentation, scientific collaboration, and long-term environmental significance. The judge listened attentively before instructing both parties to conclude their arguments. 2 days later, the courtroom filled once again for the final decision. Eleanor sat quietly beside Daniel Harper without any visible emotion. Richard appeared noticeably older than when the proceedings had begun, his confident posture replaced by visible exhaustion. After reviewing hundreds of exhibits and weeks of testimony, the judge addressed the courtroom. She explained that the evidence clearly demonstrated Titan Ridge had failed to complete reasonable historical and legal due diligence before authorizing construction. Internal company communications revealed repeated warnings that had been ignored because financial deadlines received greater priority than proper investigation. While the court found no evidence that the company intended to damage a protected research site specifically, it concluded that reckless disregard for documented legal responsibilities had directly caused irreversible harm. The judge ordered Titan Ridge Development to pay $750 million in damages, fund long-term environmental restoration under federal supervision, reimburse all legal expenses, and permanently suspend construction across the disputed section until every preservation requirement had been satisfied. The courtroom remained silent for only a moment before reporters hurried toward the exits to deliver the breaking news. Investors immediately suspended additional funding. Within hours, financial institutions announced emergency reviews of the company's outstanding loans, and trading analysts openly questioned whether Titan Ridge could survive the judgment. Richard slowly gathered the untouched documents from the defense table, but before leaving, he glanced once toward Eleanor. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply met his eyes with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the very beginning. As Richard walked out of the courtroom surrounded by attorneys, he finally understood that the greatest mistake his company had made was not disturbing protected land. It had been believing that careful records, patient stewardship, and one determined widow could never outweigh corporate ambition. Months after the final ruling, the landscape around Eleanor Brooks's farm began to transform in ways that no one in the county had imagined. The headlines eventually faded, investors moved on to other projects, and Titan Ridge Development became a reminder of what could happen when ambition moved faster than responsibility. But for Eleanor, the story was never about defeating a corporation. It was about protecting something that had been entrusted to her long before anyone knew its true value. In the weeks following the court decision, restoration specialists carefully returned to the western fields with a mission far different from the one that had brought the machines there before. Instead of construction crews measuring roads and foundations, scientists walked the land carrying research equipment, maps, and decades of knowledge. Every remaining section of soil was examined. Every surviving plant was documented. The goal was not to recreate the past exactly, because everyone understood that some losses could never be replaced. The goal was to honor what remained and allow new life to grow from the foundation Samuel Brooks had protected for so many years. Eleanor spent many mornings walking through the restored fields with Dr. Rebecca Collins, discussing the future of the agricultural research site. The money from the settlement could have allowed Eleanor to leave the farm forever. She could have purchased a comfortable home somewhere far away, traveled, and enjoyed a quiet retirement. Many people expected her to do exactly that. Instead, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She used a significant portion of the settlement to establish the Brooks Agricultural Preservation Foundation, creating scholarships for young farmers, funding agricultural research, and supporting the preservation of rare plant varieties. Samuel always believed knowledge should be shared, Eleanor explained during the foundation's opening ceremony. A seed only matters because it continues growing. Over the next several years, the former development area slowly changed. The roads that had been planned for luxury homes were never completed. The empty construction zones were replaced with walking paths, research fields, and protected green spaces where students and scientists could study sustainable agriculture. What was once intended to become a symbol of corporate expansion became something entirely different. It became a place dedicated to patience, education, and preservation. Richard Caldwell never returned to the county after Titan Ridge collapsed. Former employees described him as someone who had spent years believing every problem could be solved with enough money, enough influence, or enough pressure. But the Brooks farm taught him a lesson that no business strategy could overcome. Some things have value because of what they represent, not because of what they can be sold for. Years later, visitors walking through the restored fields often stopped beneath the oldest remaining trees. Small signs explained the history of the land, the research that had taken place there, and the family who protected it when doing so seemed impossible. Eleanor, now in her 80s, still walked those paths regularly. She carried the same quiet confidence she had shown from the beginning. She never described herself as a hero. She simply believed she had done what anyone should do when something meaningful is placed in their care. One autumn afternoon, standing beneath a tree grown from one of Samuel's preserved root samples, Eleanor looked across the fields and remembered the day everything seemed lost. The empty land, the broken promises, and the company that believed it had already won. But time revealed the truth. The developers had measured the land in dollars and deadlines. Eleanor had measured it in memories, responsibility, and generations yet to come. And that difference was something no corporation could ever purchase. The greatest lesson from the Brooks farm was simple. Quiet people are often underestimated, but patience can be stronger than pressure, and the deepest roots are usually the ones that survive the strongest storms.